Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar on procedures to submit samples for arthropods. I'm Liz Fernandez with Professional People Training and happy to have all of you with us for this webinar. I just want to make sure everybody knows you can please feel free to put questions in the chat during the actual presentation, and then we'll go ahead and answer those questions at the end of the presentation. Our presenter for today's webinar is Stephen Young. Stephen enjoys his work as a parasitologist at the National Centers for Animal Health, National Veterinary Services Laboratory, Parasitology Lab in Ames, Iowa, which is his home state. A lifelong public servant, Stephen excelled as a PPQ officer and then entomologist identifier for PPQ for 11 years before joining veterinary services in 2020. When he isn't working as an entomologist, he's an author, small-scale chicken farmer, chef, educator, and eclectic entrepreneur. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you all for coming to my talk on procedures to submit samples for arthropods. The first thing that we need to know when we're submitting samples is where to send them. You send all of the parasitology samples to NVSL Parasitology. And the parasites I'm talking about are arthropods. Those are your mites, your insects, your spiders, anything else with jointed legs and a chitinous exoskeleton. That comes to us. We also will take parasitic worms, including tapeworms, roundworms, trematodes, and others. What not to send to us, though, are things like tissue samples or anything that's alive or disease samples, or if you have plant pests. These aren't things that we're going to be able to cover here. We don't have the resources for them. There's other places to send each of these things, but they aren't the NVSL Parasitology Lab. It's very simple to know what to do when you want to preserve arthropods. Almost every time, you're just going to put them into 70% alcohol. That's it. Just put them in a container with 70% alcohol and send them to us. If you're a skilled entomologist and you want to pin a specimen, and it's a kind of specimen that ought to be pinned, something like, a butterfly or a moth, although we don't take plant-feeding pests, and there really is only a few kinds of parasitic moth out there, you can always pin them. Or if you have an adult fly that would be better pinned than put in alcohol, you can do that too. But if you've never pinned a specimen before, or if you just don't feel comfortable pinning one, always go back and just put in the 70% alcohol and send it to us. Don't send us things in formalin or formaldehyde. For one thing, that's not the proper preservative for an arthropod. It doesn't do as good a job as the alcohol. For another thing, those are a little more hazardous than alcohol, and our lab is not set up to handle those hazardous chemicals as well as we do alcohol. Also, on rare occasions, you can use isopropanol, which is just your common isopropyl rubbing alcohol, or propylene glycol if you've used a propylene glycol-based trap to catch your insects. It's rarely necessary, but if you need to send it in like that, go right ahead and make sure to label that it is in either isopropanol or propylene glycol. You can also always label that it's in 70% ethanol. In fact, it's probably better that you do, and certain agencies require that you do to mail it. But if you don't label it, we will assume it is 70% ethanol. Also, never send us live pests. We're not a live insect lab. If you send them to us live, they will only be live for as long as it takes them to get to us and for us to kill them. We will put them down in the way that you would expect by placing them in a vial of 70% ethanol. Also, if you send us unpreserved things that are dead in a dry vial and sometimes producing mold or rotting in other ways, or if you send us a tick that is stuck between two pieces of tape, or if you put it in water and it doesn't preserve it, we aren't necessarily going to be able to give you a great ID on that because we rely on the morphology to be able to identify these things. And when a thing rots, its morphology goes away. So please make sure that you preserve your things in 70% alcohol and send them to us that way. Another good thing to do is to know how to label your vials correctly. The best way to do it is internal labels on archival rag paper with either a dark pencil or permanent ink, which means in this case alcohol-proof ink. and external labels with pencil and permanent or permanent ink. For our own reference collection, we use both internal and external labels to make sure we know what it was, where it came from, and every other bit of data that we need on the label. If you don't have archival rag paper, or your penmanship isn't that great, or it's otherwise not a viable thing to do to be able to do all of the work of doing everything you would need for a collection, you can always use you can always laser print labels, cut them out and put those inside, or put printed labels on the outside. The laser printing burns the ink into the paper, and that prevents the alcohol from dissolving it. Inkjet printers don't work nearly as well as laser printed ones do. Fortunately, most government offices have laser printers available, so if you need a label, that's the way to do it. However, it's not uncommon that we get poorly labeled specimens, and any paper or ink that dissolves in alcohol is a poor label. You can see in the picture here, this is about 30 seconds after having written the word regular ink in regular ink and archival ink in archival ink. The regular ink, even after 30 seconds in the alcohol, is already fading away, and within a minute or two wouldn't even be legible anymore. The archival ink will look exactly like that for the next several hundred years if you leave it in alcohol, because archival ink doesn't go anywhere. Still, if we get a poor label, that's not the worst possible label. The worst possible label is no label at all. If you send us just a specimen with no information associated with it, we're not going to be able to do much with it. Another question is how much to fill the vials. The vials should have enough fluid to preserve the specimen. You don't want any parts sticking out above the fluid, and the intent of this is preservation. You're not trying to save as much fluid as possible and put in just enough fluid to barely cover the specimen. You're also not trying to fill the vial to the very top, because when that vial hits a different sort of pressure, either by going up in altitude if you ship it by air, or by going up in altitude if it goes over a mountain range in ground shipping, that vial can burst. But that air gives it a nice cushion. That air helps protect it. So you want to fill them right about 2/3 the way. You don't want to pack the vial so full of specimens that they are more than halfway up the vial. We have received vials that were packed full of specimens, sometimes literally packed, where they kept pushing in tick after tick until the vial would hold no more, and then filled in the cracks with alcohol. That doesn't preserve them especially well. You only want to have your specimens at most up to half the vial. And you want to fill your alcohol to around 2/3 to 3/4. You can see where it is on the vial in the specimen to the right. That's about where you want it. You also want to use larger containers or multiple vials if you have larger samples. So if you have a ton of ticks and you need to send them all in one shipment, it's okay to use a well-sealed jar if the jar is the right size container for it. Do be aware though, vials can leak, jars can leak. You want to use a screw cap or a really good push cap to be able to seal it well. If you have corks or poorly sealing screw caps or any other non-scientific containers, those tend to work rather poorly. And then your alcohol leaks out and gets the box wet if you haven't put it in a secondary containment, or it gets all of your paperwork wet. Generally, you don't want the alcohol leaking out because it doesn't do good things for the sample you're submitting. And with your sample, make sure to send an APHIS 538 form. An APHIS 538 is the parasite submission form. It's the one form we use for parasite submissions. There's also a form 10-4 out there. Don't use the 10-4 when you're submitting ticks or other parasites to us. Use the 538, which is the parasite submission form. And it's divided into 3 different sections. The first section of which is the submitter section. That takes about up about half the paper. You don't have to read the little blanks now, but just know that the top half of this is your submitter section that you're going to need to fill out. You're going to want to either type this or handwrite it. If you handwrite it, make sure you have neat handwriting. Handwriting errors are the most common errors that we end up having to correct in NVSL, and some of them are uncorrectable just because the handwriting is truly illegible. And if you make errors in your handwriting, we will transcribe them exactly. If you misspell something that is even commonly spelled just by flipping a couple letters around, we will transcribe it that way all the way to the final document. Also, if you don't know something, leave the blank unknown. You don't have to fill in every single blank. So if there is something you don't know, don't guess at it, because misinformation is even worse to deal with than no information. So moving on to the specifics of the submitter form, this first set of blanks you're going to fill out is your information as the submitter. The submitter is the person who sends the specimen, and they will be the one who received the identification results when we have returned the report. So the submitter needs to put their name in box 1. If you happen to be a frequent submitter, you might have an NVSL submitter ID to put in box 2. If you're associated with a business, that goes in box 3. If you're with a nonprofit or another lab or something like that, that still goes in box 3. Box 4 is your mailing address, where if for some reason we need to mail something back to you, that's where we would mail it. 5 and 6 and 7 are the rest of your address. 8 is the telephone number you want us to contact if we need to contact you for some reason about the specimen. If you have a fax number, you can put it in 9. And then 10 is your email address. It's fairly straightforward, but this is your contact information. It's not anyone else's. It's whoever is sending it in, and not who collected it and not who owns it. For who owns it and who collected it, you fill out the next blanks. You fill out the owner of the host animal when you're submitting a parasite. If the animal is wild, use the word wildlife. And you use their residence and not the collection location for the owner's name with their city, state, and zip code. We're trying to find out who owns this, not where it was collected. We'll fill in that information later. The collector is the person who actually physically collected it. And this is often the same person as the owner, and it may be the same person as the owner and the submitter. For instance, if we have a PPQ officer who finds a tick on themselves, they would say that they were the collector. They own themselves because they do, so they would be the owner, and they would be the submitter. If it's on their dog, again, they would be the collector, the owner, and the submitter. But if they collected off someone else's dog, they would be the collector and the submitter, but someone else would be the owner. It's fairly straightforward. We also have number 16 for a box down here, which is the port. If this is a US port of entry, that is the port that you put it at, because there are official US ports of entry out there, and it's very useful information for us to have. On the other half of the submitter side, when you're looking at a 538 form, this is on the right side of that top section. If you have a specimen ID, you put that there. Specimen ID is just the number or letters or name that you have assigned to the specimen for yourselves internally. The date collected is when you collected the specimen. And then there are boxes 19 and 21. They are not redundant. One is county, the other is country. These two get confused sometimes. County is the county where you collected it. The country is the country where you collected it. And if you're in the United States, that's just going to be USA. Box number 20 up there is the state. It's fairly straightforward. And then we also have the premises ID. If you've been assigned, if this is collected off of an official premises, you put down that ID number there. If you don't know what that is, or if it's confusing, you can leave that blank. Latitude and longitude are pretty self-explanatory. You put in the latitude and longitude of where you collected the specimen. If you don't know the exact latitude and longitude of where you collected the specimen, it's best not to guess. It's best not to say the latitude and longitude of, say, your home office or your home address, because it will be assumed that the specimen came from that exact location. Also, make sure that you get the latitude and longitude exactly right when you record them, so that if we have to do any follow-up actions, we get to the right place. Host origin is where the host originally came from. For instance, if you were inspecting a cow from Mexico and it had come across the US border, the inspection location and the place you collected it would be on the US side of the border, but the host's origin would be Mexico. And knowing that origin is a very valuable thing for us because ticks tend to live in certain geographic regions. So make sure you put down the origin. And then the host species is probably the trickiest box on this whole thing to fill out. The best thing you can put down is the scientific name. If you know the scientific name of your species, put that down. Also, don't try to use a subfamily name. We get a lot of specimens submitted as feline or canine, but feline and canine are subfamily names. And we have both wolves and domestic dogs and a few other dogs in the canine. And then in the feline, we have domestic cats and wild cats and other cat species around the world. Now, it might seem very logical to the submitter which one this is, but we get a lot of interesting ticks from a lot of interesting species. So it's really helpful to have the exact species. We'll also take common names. If you write house cat, we know that's going to be a domestic house cat. We know that you don't have some random cat from the Sahara living in your house. We know that this is just the domestic species. If you say domestic dog, we know what that is. Same with sheep, horse, cow. Common names are better than going up to the subfamily level. Species names are best, but that is the one box that we really tend to get a lot of interesting errors on. Where it was found on the host can be anywhere on the host. You just put down the part where you found it on. If you found it on the head, you say the head. If you found it on the tail, you say the tail. And that actually matters for a lot of parasites because we do have certain lice and other things that live only on certain parts of the host. So that can be some surprisingly useful information. And then the animal ID is if you have an ID associated with that animal. This is distinct from box 17 up there, which is the specimen ID. Your animal ID is the ID for that animal. Your specimen would be as if you are assigning a number to that specimen, but that is up to you to put down. For number of animals and lot, that is how many animals you inspected, because sometimes people inspect a group of animals and pull off all of the parasites and submit them together. If you do that, and you want to record the number of animals infested, you can record that in box 30. But it can be very helpful to know if there were a number of animals in the lot to know the level of infestation. For instance, if you pull 1,000 ticks off of one animal, it's very different than pulling off 1,000 ticks from 500 animals. Below all of these is box 31, which is a very valuable box. This is the history or the additional information. It's really good to know what's in the history of the animal. Was this previously infested? Has this been treated? Was it in other locations, especially unusual locations? Was it associated with other animals? All of this stuff is very valuable for us to know. Just as a for instance, if we get a dog tick and it came off of something odd, like a parrot, it would be good to know if that parrot had been kept in a kennel near dogs that were infested with known dog ticks. Things like that are very useful for us. And it's also better to have more information than not enough, so feel free to write as much information as you want in that additional information box. Everything you give us will be read, everything you give us may be valuable. We also will look at permit numbers or other things that you want to put in there. If it received a phytosanitary permit from somewhere else and showed up with a pest on it, that's good information to know. Really, anything else that you can add that you think would help, or even things that you just don't think would help, but no, those are good to put in the additional information box. If you have an emergency or a really high priority case, you can contact us directly. You can contact the supervisor of the parasitology lab, or you can contact any individual scientist in the parasitology lab if you know who you're trying to reach. And you can call, text, message, or email through any of our official channels. Just make sure that the other person on the other end responds, because sometimes we are in the lab for many hours at a time. Sometimes we are on travel. Sometimes we even take time off. Make sure that someone actually has responded if there is an emergency, that you've actually had contact with a person. If it's a high priority case, you can contact the individual scientists. And you can contact one or several of us, depending on the case, and let us know your timeline. If you need this back by next Friday, let us know right away and we'll try to get it back to you by next Friday. It's also best not to let us know Thursday at 4:30 that you need it on Friday morning at 7 o'clock. We may be able to pull it off, but it's going to be tricky. And once you know what you are sending and where you are sending it to, once you have it in the alcohol where it needs to go, it's time to pack it for shipping. You'll want to follow your current agency guidelines, and they do change by agency. Homeland Security, PPQ, Veterinary Services, we all have our specific guidelines that we have to follow. There are limits to how much alcohol you are allowed to send in a single shipment. And we also have agreements with certain couriers, and there are labeling requirements for that alcohol. Just make sure you've kept current on your own agency's guidelines. You also never want to use that alcohol dissolvable ink for your shipping things because sometimes vials leak, and you'll want to package the paperwork with the specimens. Don't just send a bare specimen and don't just send bare paperwork. Make sure that they come together. It's good to package them together. Also make sure that you've used alcohol proof ink or a pencil if you have filled out that 538, or if you've printed a copy, print it with a laser printer and try to use vials that don't leak like we talked about earlier. You'll need to make sure you have adequate padding for whatever vial you've used. If you're using a very strong polycarbonate vial, then it might not need a whole lot of padding because polycarbonate's very tough. If you're using a glass vial, you're going to want a little more padding because glass can break when it gets crushed. To that end, try to use crush-proof packaging. Below is one of the mailing tubes that we tend to get. These are short, stocky tubes, and they are very, very tough. They've got a nice steel cap and thick cardboard. You can see over here, this is a well-packed specimen. It has some absorbent material in with a vial. The vial has the label inside. You don't see it in this picture, but the 538 is included with it, and it is all rolled up nicely in all of this packing material and put into a crush-proof package. And once you've got it all packed up, you send it to USDA APHIS PPQ, the National Vet Services Lab, Parasitology, at 1800 Dayton Avenue, Ames, Iowa 50010. Also, over to the right, this is what happens when you have a leaky vial and regular ink. It leaks out, the ink starts fading, and sometimes it goes away entirely. We do need physical specimens for identification. Once in a while, we can issue a digital identification, but only under really rare circumstances. This is maybe less than 10% of the specimens that we receive could be identified digitally, and even of those, it's very difficult. So unless there is a critical need for something digital, we do need that physical one. A critical need for a digital identification would be as if the physical specimen were somehow destroyed. It goes on a FedEx plane, the FedEx plane goes down, the specimen burns up. Well, we're going to do the best we can with the digital images we have because there is no specimen. But as a general rule, we only take physical specimens. We also will return specimens on request. If you need your specimen back for some reason, let us know. If you don't need your specimen back, we will keep it indefinitely. Once your specimen has arrived at NDSL, it does not come straight to us. It goes to specimen processing. It's received and processed. They make copies of the paperwork. They put it with other specimens in a bag, and they deliver it over to our building. And then we go and we pick it up at the delivery site. And once we receive these, we begin looking at them and sorting them and identifying them right away. This usually happens about midday because the samples will arrive in the morning, be sorted by sample processing in the morning, sent over, and then we get them later. Also, sometimes in the processing, the sample will get detached from the paperwork. This is when it's really valuable to have that internal label. Once we receive it, we identify it, and we usually issue an identification of the specimen within 3 days. It's assigned a number, and then we save the specimen. The 3 days does not include weekends or holidays. If something arrives to us on a Friday morning, it might not be identified until the next Monday or Tuesday. Usually we try to do 1 day, but we do allow ourselves up to 3 days. However, getting it identified does not mean you will get your answer back right away. The identified samples do get stored indefinitely. Our valuable ones go to the reference collection. Our routine ones go to long-term storage. We do save these for research in our historical, or in our just sort of a historical archive of the specimens we've received. And on occasion, we'll actually pull them out, do studies with them, see what we have. It's very valuable to have this. After all of this, though, we do get the paperwork we have our paperwork delivered to the data entry people. And our data entry people then enter the data. After it's been entered, it is edited. After it's been edited, it is given a final editing review, and it's usually turned around and sent back as a formal report within a few weeks. This can be returned much faster upon request in special cases, and we can give you an informal report almost immediately upon identification. So if you need to know what something is right away, contact one of the entomologists. We can get you the information back immediately. Now, this doesn't mean that everything is an emergency or everything can be high priority, but when it really is a high priority, we do want to be there for our stakeholders. And with that, do you have any questions? Saw a couple come up in the chat.
Yeah, there is one in the chat. It says, can you order the shipping materials from NVSL?
You cannot.
You can.
No,
So where
we
would
do.
someone get those kind of vials and stuff? You would have to order them off from some scientific, like Fisher Scientific or something like that.
Yep, you'll have to find your own vials and your own labels. We got most of our own internal storage stuff from a company called BioQuip that went out of business a few years ago, and we're still working off of that. But it really is up to your homework unit to decide what you want for vials and to find a place to order them yourself. If you are having a lot of trouble, you can email one of the scientists here at NVSL. We can give you recommendations. So if you don't know exactly where to get your things, feel free to send me an email and I can at least point you to some quality vials.
Great. Anybody else have any questions? You can either put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, that was good. I'm glad you asked the question about the shipping materials because I just assumed that you would get them from VSL. So that's good to know.
Yep. I will say that the shipping we've gotten at VS is a lot more consistently good than some of the shipping we would get in PPQ. In my early days of PPQ, once in a while we would get a glass vial that had been placed in an envelope and it arrived with the expected results.
That's not good.
Yeah, don't just put a vial in an envelope. Also make sure that they're well sealed. Also make sure that they're not rotten or just in water or just dry.
Anybody have any questions? Can you use plastic F50 milliliter tubes?
Yes, you can, and we do receive those. If you send plastic 50 milliliter tubes, that does work well for keeping the specimens preserved, and they usually arrive intact. You may want to throw a strip of parafilm around the top, but other than that, we do get those, and they do work pretty well. Also, if you have something that is big enough that it requires a 50 milliliter tube, we're going to have a very exciting day. So please do send that in.
Yes, they have 50 milliliter tubes. They order those from NBSL. There's also like 5 milliliter tubes that you can also get. They're a smaller tube. You can also dump the stuff out of it and use that tube. I was thinking that because our fads would have those.
One heads up with the smaller tubes, though, if you get a tick that you have to force down into the tube, we're not going to be able to easily get it out. We've had to break tubes before, and it doesn't do good things to the specimen.
Very good. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because they are small. They're only about this big. Okay, where to order the writing pen? That's a good question.
One of the best pens you can order is a Pigma Micron pen. They're widely available. Oh, vacutainer tubes. Those are excellent, but I will just write out in the chat Pigma Micron for anyone who wants to copy that down. But these are really excellent pens, and they are the standard for entomologists everywhere for writing a label. Radio, I think it's radiograph tubes or radiograph pens also work. Really, any ink that is permanent and alcohol proof will do the job. But Pigma Micron has held up excellently for me over the years, and I think it's held up excellently for a lot of others. To answer Denise's question, we are okay with vacutainer tubes. Those work out very well for us. If you get them without heparin in them or without other things added to them, those are the ones to use. See if you can include ones that don't come with non-alcohol fluids.